Was our kiss a mistake? The billionaire CEO's roommate returned the key that night. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's emotional story about two women discovering love in the most unexpected way, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss a new story from our channel. It is quick, it is free, and it helps us continue bringing you more heartfelt, dramatic and unforgettable stories about courage, healing and love between women. Your support truly means the world to us. And tell me, where are you watching from today? Share your city or country in the comments below. Thank you so much. Now let us return to our main character and the moment her life began to change. The hardest doors to close are the ones that lead to the life you secretly wanted. I used to believe money could solve almost anything. A delayed shipment could be expedited. A failing company could be acquired. A damaged reputation could be repaired with the right strategy and enough patience. But loneliness ignored every contract I ever signed. My name is Victoria Hayes, and for the last 12 years I had been the CEO of one of the fastest growing technology firms in Seattle. Every magazine article called me fearless. Every financial interview described me as decisive. Every employee saw a woman who never hesitated. None of them knew that I dreaded walking into my own penthouse after sunset because silence had become the loudest voice in my life. After my engagement quietly fell apart almost a year earlier, I buried myself in work so completely that entire weekends disappeared without me noticing. Friends stopped calling because I always answered with the same polite excuse. Investors admired my discipline. My board praised my focus. Yet every evening I found myself eating dinner alone, while the city lights shimmered beyond floor-to-ceiling windows that felt more like walls than a reward for success. That was exactly why I made a decision none of my colleagues could understand. I rented out the guest suite in my penthouse. Not because I needed the money. I simply wanted another human presence under the same roof. The applications flooded in, filled with polished resumes and carefully crafted introductions. Lawyers, consultants, graduate students. Then I found one that almost seemed too ordinary to notice. Emily Carter, 29 years old, freelance graphic designer, recently relocated to Seattle, looking for a temporary place while saving money to help pay for her mother's medical treatment. There was no attempt to impress me. No exagerati de achievements. Just honesty. Something about those few simple paragraphs made me pause longer than any executive proposal had in months. When she arrived carrying two well-used suitcases and a single cardboard box filled with books, she smiled as though moving into a stranger's home was simply another ordinary Tuesday. She thanked the building staff by name within minutes, complimented the doorman on his garden, and apologized for taking up space in the elevator. I couldn't remember the last time I'd met someone who treated every person with the same quiet kindness. She looked around the penthouse without envy, without curiosity, almost as if expensive furniture meant less to her than the sunlight pouring through the kitchen windows. I explained the house rules with my usual professional tone. Keep shared spaces clean. Let me know before inviting guests. Respect each other's privacy. Emily listened carefully before nodding with a warm smile that somehow softened the entire room. That sounds fair, she said. Home should feel peaceful for both of us. Home. The word caught me off guard. I had called this place an investment, a property, an address. I couldn't remember the last time anyone had called it a home. As she carried the last box toward the guest suite, I watched the front door quietly close behind her and realized that for the first time in almost a year, the silence inside my penthouse had finally changed. The first week passed with the kind of quiet rhythm that made me question how I had ever lived differently. Emily woke before 7 every morning, not because she had to, but because she liked watching the sunrise paint the Seattle skyline gold while she drank coffee from the oversized ceramic mug she had brought from home. I usually left for the office before 8, dressed in tailored suits and already answering emails before stepping into the elevator. Somehow she always noticed when I skipped breakfast. One Tuesday morning as I reached for my laptop bag, she placed a small container on the kitchen island. You forgot to eat yesterday too, she said gently. Blueberry oatmeal. It travels well. I almost explained that I did not have time, but the words never came. No assistant had ever spoken to me that way. No executive ever would. She was not criticizing me. She simply cared. That realization followed me through every meeting that day. By Friday evening, our routines had quietly begun overlapping. Sometimes I returned home to the smell of fresh vegetable soup simmering on the stove. Other nights I found Emily sketching logo concepts on her tablet, while soft jazz drifted through the living room. We rarely interrupted each other's work, yet somehow sharing the same space no longer felt like an inconvenience. It felt balanced. One rainy Saturday, I noticed her struggling with several grocery bags outside the building. Without thinking, I grabbed an umbrella and walked downstairs myself instead of asking the concierge to help. She laughed when she saw me standing in the rain wearing an expensive coat that was definitely not designed for grocery runs. "You really did not have to come all the way down," she said. "Apparently I did," I answered before realizing how honest that sounded. We carried the bags upstairs together, joking about my complete inability to choose ripe avocados. She claimed it was a life skill everyone should have. I insisted billion-dollar mergers were more useful. She smiled and replied, "You cannot spread a merger on toast." I laughed harder than I had in months. The sound surprised both of us. Later that afternoon, while she organized groceries, I noticed a stack of unopened medical bills tucked carefully beneath a notebook on the counter. Emily quickly slid them aside, but not before I recognized the hospital logo. I pretended not to notice because pride deserves privacy. Instead, I asked whether her mother was feeling better. Emily's smile softened. "Some days are easier than others," she admitted. "She keeps telling me to stop worrying about her and start living my own life." She looked down at the apple she was arranging into a bowl. Mothers always say things like that. There was a quiet sadness in her voice that lingered long after the conversation ended. That evening I stood alone on the balcony overlooking the city, watching headlights weave through rain-soaked streets below. Success had taught me how to measure profits, calculate risks, and negotiate impossible deals. Yet I had no idea how someone with so little compared to me could make every room feel warmer simply by walking into it. For the first time in years, I caught myself looking forward to going home before the workday was over, and that realization unsettled me far more than any boardroom confrontation ever had. 3 weeks after Emily moved in, I experienced something that had never happened during my entire career. I missed an evening conference call because I completely lost track of time. It was not caused by carelessness. It was caused by laughter. Emily had convinced me to help assemble a small wooden bookshelf she had ordered online, insisting the instructions were written by someone who secretly enjoyed confusing people. I confidently declared that I negotiated multimillion-dollar contracts every week and could certainly build one simple bookshelf. 40 minutes later we were staring at a pile of extra screws and a shelf that leaned several inches to one side. Emily covered her mouth, trying not to laugh, but the effort lasted only a few seconds before we were both laughing so hard that tears formed in our eyes. I had forgotten what it felt like to laugh without calculating whether it was appropriate. The next Monday reminded me why I had built walls around my life in the first place. The board meeting stretched into its 6th exhausting hour after an important acquisition suddenly became uncertain. Every executive around the table looked toward me for answers, expecting confidence even while uncertainty filled the room. By the time I returned home, it was nearly 10 o'clock. My shoulders ached, my head pounded, and I could barely remember whether I had eaten lunch. As I unlocked the front door, I expected the familiar darkness that usually greeted me after late nights. Instead, a soft lamp glowed in the living room. Emily sat on the couch with a sketchbook resting across her knees. She looked up immediately and smiled with quiet relief. "I was beginning to wonder if another board meeting had decided to keep you overnight," she joked gently. I managed a tired smile before dropping my briefcase beside the door. "It almost did." She studied my face for a moment without saying another word. Then she disappeared into the kitchen and returned carrying a warm bowl of homemade tomato soup with grilled cheese sandwiches cut into neat halves. "I guessed you probably skipped dinner," she said. "I hope I guessed correctly." I looked at the meal, then back at her, suddenly overwhelmed by a kindness I had not expected. Nobody had waited up for me in years. Nobody had looked at my face and immediately understood that I needed care more than conversation. I thanked her quietly and took the first spoonful. The warmth spread through me far beyond the meal itself. We spent the next half hour talking about completely ordinary things. Her latest design project, a bookstore she wanted to visit, my embarrassing inability to keep houseplants alive. There were no discussions about stock prices or quarterly reports.
No negotiations. No expectations.
Just two women sharing an evening that somehow felt more valuable than every expensive dinner I had attended that month. Before heading to bed, Emily gathered the empty dishes and paused near the hallway. "Victoria," she said softly, "you do not always have to carry everything alone." She spoke the words so naturally that I almost forgot to breathe. After she disappeared into her room, I remained standing in the quiet kitchen, staring at the empty soup bowl. For years I had believed strength meant never allowing anyone to see exhaustion, fear, or uncertainty. Yet somehow the strongest moment of my day had not happened in the boardroom. It had happened in my own home, when someone looked past the title of Chief Executive Officer and simply saw a tired woman who needed someone to care whether she had eaten dinner. The weather changed without warning the following Friday evening. Dark clouds rolled across Seattle just as I left the office, and by the time I reached the underground parking garage, rain was falling so heavily that the streets looked like flowing rivers beneath the city lights. Traffic slowed to a crawl, and every notification on my phone seemed louder than the storm outside. When I finally arrived home nearly an hour later than usual, the entire building was dark. The neighborhood had lost power. Emergency lights glowed faintly in the lobby, and the elevator was out of service, leaving me to climb 23 flights of stairs in complete silence. By the time I unlocked the penthouse door, I was exhausted. The apartment was illuminated only by a few candles scattered across the kitchen island and the living room. Their soft light transformed the familiar space into something warmer and strangely unfamiliar. Emily looked up from the couch with a relieved smile. "I was hoping you would not get stuck downtown," she said. "The power has been out for almost an hour." I loosened my jacket and laughed quietly. I have survived shareholder meetings that felt less challenging than climbing those stairs. She smiled and handed me a flashlight before disappearing into the kitchen. A few moments later she returned carrying 2 steaming mugs of hot chocolate. "I figured coffee was not the right answer this late," she said. We settled onto the balcony just outside the living room, wrapped in light blankets against the cool evening air. Without the usual glow of office towers, the skyline looked softer, almost peaceful. Rain tapped gently against the railing while distant thunder rolled across the bay. For several minutes neither of us spoke. It was the kind of silence that felt comforting instead of awkward. Emily finally broke it with a quiet question. "When was the last time you gave yourself a day off?" I tried to remember, then realized I honestly could not. "I am not sure," I admitted. Somewhere along the way I convinced myself that stopping meant falling behind. She nodded thoughtfully. "My mother always says, people are not machines. Even machines need maintenance." I smiled into my mug. "Your mother sounds wiser than most business consultants." Emily laughed softly before her expression became more reflective. "She also says that sometimes the strongest people are the ones who finally admit they are tired." Her words settled gently between us. I stared out at the rain, watching tiny reflections dance across the wet balcony floor. "I used to think success would make everything else easier," I confessed. "Instead it became easier to hide behind success than admit I was lonely." The sentence surprised me the moment it left my mouth. I had never said those words aloud to anyone. Emily turned toward me, her eyes filled not with pity but with understanding. "You do not seem lonely when you are here," she said quietly. "You seem like someone who forgot she deserves the same kindness she gives everyone else." I looked at her, really looked at her, as the candlelight reflected softly in her eyes. Time seemed to slow until neither of us spoke another word. Drawn together by a moment that felt completely honest, we shared a brief, gentle kiss that lasted only an instant before we both pulled back in surprise. My heart raced with confusion as reality returned all at once. I stood abruptly, taking an uncertain step backward. "Emily," I whispered, struggling to steady my voice. I do not know if that should have happened." She lowered her eyes, offering a small, uncertain nod, while the rain continued falling around us, carrying away the quiet certainty we had both shared only moments before. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I found myself back on the balcony, hearing the rain, feeling the quiet that had existed just before everything changed. By morning, the electricity had returned, but something far more important had gone missing. The easy comfort we had built over the past several weeks suddenly felt fragile. I left my bedroom earlier than usual, hoping to apologize before leaving for work. The apartment was silent. A fresh pot of coffee still sat on the kitchen counter, filling the room with its familiar aroma, but there was no soft music, no sketchbook resting beside the window, no cheerful greeting wishing me a good morning. I assumed Emily had stepped out for a walk, yet something about the stillness felt different. Then I noticed the guest room door standing open. The room was spotless. The bed had been made with perfect care. The bookshelf we had laughed over while assembling together now stood neatly against the wall, filled with only a few forgotten paper bookmarks. My heartbeat quickened as I walked farther inside. The closet was empty. The dresser drawers were open. Her suitcases were gone. I stood frozen until my eyes landed on a single silver key, resting on the nightstand beside a folded note. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The note contained only one sentence written in careful handwriting. "Thank you for making me feel at home." That was all.
No explanation.
No promise to call.
No anger. No accusation.
Only gratitude. Somehow that hurt even more. I sank onto the edge of the bed, turning the key over in my hand again and again as though it might reveal a different answer if I looked closely enough. My mind immediately returned to the previous evening. I heard my own uncertain words repeating over and over. I do not know if that should have happened. Had she believed I regretted everything? Had I made her feel unwelcome in the one place where she had finally begun to feel safe? For the first time in years, I canceled my morning meetings without offering an explanation. My assistant sounded shocked, but I could not bring myself to care. The penthouse suddenly felt larger than ever before. Every corner reminded me of Emily. The extra mug she always used sat drying beside the sink. A grocery list in her handwriting remained attached to the refrigerator with a small magnet shaped like a lighthouse. The blanket we had shared during the storm was still folded across the couch. Ordinary objects had somehow become impossible to ignore. Throughout the day I checked my phone far more often than I cared to admit. No messages appeared. I considered calling her, but what would I even say? Would I apologize for a moment that had felt honest? Or would I apologize for letting fear speak before my heart had the chance? As evening settled over Seattle once again, I found myself standing alone on the balcony where everything had changed less than 24 hours earlier. The city lights shimmered below exactly as they always had, yet nothing looked the same anymore. I closed my fingers around the small silver key and realized that Emily had not simply returned access to a room. She had unknowingly taken with her the quiet hope that this lonely penthouse had finally become a home. The next morning I forced myself back into the routine that had defined my life for years. Meetings filled every hour. Financial reports covered my desk. Executives discussed expansion plans with the same confidence they always had. I answered every question correctly, yet I could not remember a single decision I made by the end of the afternoon. My thoughts kept returning to the small silver key resting inside my desk drawer at home. Late that evening, after another unsuccessful attempt to distract myself with work, my phone rang. The screen displayed an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it before finally answering. "Miss Hayes," a calm voice asked. "My name is Linda Carter. I hope I am not disturbing you." The last name immediately caught my attention. "Emily's mother?" I asked quietly. There was a brief pause before she answered. "She told me about you. I wanted to thank you for opening your home to my daughter." Relief mixed with confusion rushed through me all at once. "Is Emily with you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "She is," Linda replied softly. "She has barely left my hospital room since yesterday morning." My heart sank. Hospital. Linda explained that her condition had suddenly worsened during the night of the storm. Emily received the emergency call shortly before sunrise and packed as quickly as she could because every minute mattered. She had not wanted to wake me after such an emotional evening, and she feared that staying long enough to explain everything would only make leaving more difficult. I closed my eyes, realizing how completely I had misunderstood everything. Emily had not left because she regretted our quiet moment together. She had left because her mother needed her. The key had never been a rejection. It had been a practical gesture from someone who believed she might be gone longer than expected. She kept saying she did not want to become another responsibility in your already busy life, Linda continued gently. She thinks very highly of you. Those words settled heavily in my heart. Emily had spent weeks caring about whether I had eaten dinner, whether I had rested, whether I smiled, while quietly carrying worries of her own that she rarely allowed anyone else to see. After the call ended, I remained sitting in my office long after every floor around me had gone dark. I replayed our last conversation again and again, hearing not only my uncertainty but also the fear hidden beneath it. I had allowed doubt to speak louder than honesty. The following morning I asked my assistant to clear my entire schedule for the rest of the week. She stared at me in disbelief because I had never canceled meetings without replacing them. "Is everything all right?" she asked carefully. I smiled for the first time in days. "Not yet," I answered. "But I finally know what matters most." As I picked up my coat and slipped the small silver key into my pocket, I understood something my years of success had never taught me. The greatest mistake had not been one quiet, heartfelt kiss. The greatest mistake had been believing that love should retreat whenever life became complicated, instead of choosing to stand beside the person who needed you most. The drive to the hospital felt longer than any business trip I had ever taken, even though it was less than 20 miles from my office. For years I had measured time by quarterly reports and shareholder meetings. That morning I measured it by traffic lights, hoping each one would change a little faster. I kept the silver key in my coat pocket, my fingers brushing against it whenever doubt tried to convince me to turn around. What if Emily did not want to see me? What if my hesitation on the balcony had already broken something too important to repair? Those questions stayed with me until I stepped through the hospital entrance and asked the receptionist for Linda Carter's room. The hallway smelled faintly of coffee and fresh flowers. Families spoke quietly outside patient rooms, each carrying their own worries. When I reached the door, I stopped for a moment, suddenly realizing that I had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions with less anxiety than I felt standing in that hallway. Before I could knock, the door opened. Emily stepped into the corridor carrying an empty paper cup. She froze the instant she saw me. Neither of us spoke. For a few seconds the busy hospital around us seemed to disappear. Her eyes looked tired from sleepless nights, yet the warmth I remembered was still there. "Victoria," she whispered, almost as though she could not believe I was standing there. I managed a small smile. "I should have come sooner." Emily looked down at the paper cup in her hands. "I wanted to call you so many times." I shook my head gently. "You did not owe me an explanation. I should have trusted you enough to ask instead of assuming the worst." She let out a slow breath, the kind people release after carrying something heavy for too long. When the hospital called that morning, everything happened so fast. I packed my things because I did not know how long I would be gone. After what happened on the balcony, I thought giving you space might make things easier. I reached into my pocket and placed the silver key in her hand. "This never felt like giving me space," I said quietly. "It felt like losing someone who had quietly become the best part of my day." Tears gathered in her eyes, but she smiled through them. "I never wanted you to think I was running away." At that moment Linda's gentle voice came from inside the room. "Emily, is someone there?" Emily glanced back before looking at me again. "Would you like to meet my mother?" she asked softly. I nodded without hesitation. Linda welcomed me with the same kindness I had already heard over the phone. We spent the next hour talking about ordinary things that somehow felt extraordinary. We laughed about Emily's famous cooking experiments, her childhood love of drawing, and the stubborn determination she had inherited from her mother. Sitting beside them, I realized that real wealth was not measured by company valuations or investment portfolios. It was measured by the people who made you feel seen without asking you to become someone else. As I prepared to leave that afternoon, Emily walked with me to the elevator. We stood there quietly until the doors opened. Before stepping inside, I looked at her and spoke the truth I had hidden behind fear for far too long. "When you are ready to come home," I said gently, "I hope you know I am not talking about the apartment anymore." The days that followed settled into a quieter rhythm, one that no longer felt driven by fear or uncertainty. I visited the hospital every afternoon after work, sometimes bringing fresh fruit, sometimes carrying coffee for Emily, and sometimes simply showing up with nothing except my time. Strangely enough, that seemed to matter most. Linda's health slowly began improving, and with every passing day the tension that had lived behind Emily's smile faded a little more. One evening, while Linda rested peacefully, Emily and I wandered into the hospital garden where late spring flowers had begun blooming along the walking paths. The air smelled faintly of lavender after a light afternoon rain, and the city noises seemed far away. We found an empty bench beneath a maple tree and sat together without speaking for several minutes. Silence no longer frightened either of us. It had become a place where honesty could finally breathe. Emily looked down at her hands before quietly breaking the silence. "Do you know what hurt me the most?" she asked. I turned toward her, listening carefully. "It was not that you questioned what happened between us." She paused, gathering the courage to continue. "It was believing that I had left without giving you the truth." My heart tightened. I nodded slowly. "Do you know what hurt me the most?" I asked. She looked at me with gentle curiosity. "It was not the empty room. It was imagining you carrying something so difficult all by yourself, while I convinced myself that you no longer wanted me in your life." Emily's eyes filled with tears she no longer tried to hide. "I never wanted to lose you," she whispered. "I just did not know how to ask you to wait for me." I reached for her hand carefully, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished. Instead, her fingers gently closed around mine. There was nothing hurried or uncertain about the moment. It simply felt true. "I spent years believing leadership meant solving every problem alone," I admitted. "Then you walked into my home and showed me that strength can also mean allowing someone to stand beside you." Emily smiled through her tears. "My mother always says love is not about rescuing each other. It is about refusing to leave when life becomes difficult." We both laughed softly because it sounded exactly like something Linda would say. At that moment she appeared at the garden entrance, moving carefully with the help of her physical therapist. She waved at us with an amused smile before pretending not to notice that we were still holding hands. Emily laughed quietly. "She sees everything." "I had already guessed that," I replied. A week later Linda received wonderful news from her doctors. She would be able to continue recovering at home. Watching Emily embrace her mother with relief reminded me that genuine happiness often arrives without grand speeches or dramatic celebrations. Sometimes it is simply hearing good news beside the people you love. As we helped gather Linda's belongings that afternoon, Emily looked at me with the same warm expression she had worn the day she first arrived at my apartment carrying 2 well-used suitcases. This time, however, there was no uncertainty between us. We had both learned that honest conversations heal misunderstandings much faster than silent assumptions ever could, and neither of us intended to let fear speak louder than truth again. 3 months passed more quickly than either of us expected. Summer sunlight now poured through the same floor-to-ceiling windows that had once reflected nothing but loneliness back at me. The penthouse sounded different too. Music drifted through the kitchen on Saturday mornings. Fresh flowers often appeared on the dining table, because Emily insisted every home deserved something alive inside it. Even my employees noticed the change. They commented that I smiled more during meetings, listened more carefully, and no longer treated every conversation like a negotiation. They assumed I had finally discovered a healthier work-life balance. They were only partly correct. The real difference was that I had finally discovered someone who reminded me that life was never meant to be lived alone. Linda recovered steadily and eventually returned to the small coastal town she loved, calling every Sunday evening without fail. She always ended each conversation with the same cheerful reminder: take good care of each other. Somehow those simple words carried more wisdom than every leadership seminar I had ever attended. One quiet Friday evening, almost exactly 3 months after the storm that changed everything, I asked Emily if she would join me on the balcony. The sky glowed with the soft colors of sunset, and the city below shimmered in warm golden light. She wrapped a light sweater around her shoulders and smiled as she stepped outside. "This view looks different now," she said. I nodded. "It does." She laughed softly. "Or maybe we do." For a moment we simply stood together, remembering everything that had brought us to this place. The lonely evenings, the shared breakfasts, the laughter over a crooked bookshelf, the storm, the misunderstanding, the hospital. Every difficult moment had quietly become part of the story that led us here. I reached into my jacket pocket and removed a small wooden box. Emily looked at it with curious surprise. "I think this belongs to you," I said. She accepted the box carefully and opened it. Resting inside was a brand new silver key, attached to a simple leather keychain. Beneath it lay a handwritten card folded neatly in half. Emily unfolded the note slowly. In careful handwriting it read, "The last key you returned opened a door I had been afraid to walk through for years. This one is different. It is not only for this home. It is for every tomorrow I hope we choose together. This time, please do not give it back." When she finished reading, she looked up with tears quietly shining in her eyes. She closed the box, stepped closer, and gently placed her hand in mine. "I was never looking for a perfect home," she whispered. "I was only hoping to find someone who felt like one." The evening breeze carried the familiar scent of rain from somewhere beyond the skyline, reminding us of the night when uncertainty had almost separated us. This time there was no fear waiting between us, only trust built through honesty, patience, and forgiveness. As the city lights slowly awakened below, I realized that success had never been the greatest achievement of my life. Learning to lower the walls around my heart had been far more difficult and infinitely more rewarding. If this journey taught me anything, it is that love rarely arrives according to our carefully designed plans. Sometimes it quietly knocks on the front door carrying 2 well-used suitcases, changes the meaning of an ordinary house, and reminds us that the strongest hearts are not the ones that never break. They are the ones brave enough to open again.